If you want to work in the wildlife field, you must listen to this episode of the Fancy Scientist podcast. Yes, must. I am making this a requirement because this episode is so good. I'm Dr. Stephanie Manka, and I've been in this field for 20 years, and I interviewed Matt Howard, who is a natural resource manager for the Department of Transportation in Utah. Matt has also worked in this field for at least 20 years. I didn't get the exact number, but he has a wealth of knowledge about what it's like to work in state agency jobs, environmental consulting jobs, and more. The reason why I invited Matt to the podcast is because he was leaving comments on my career post that had great advice. He has hired so many people. He has, of course, been hired himself and has worked across many different factors within state agencies that he just has such great advice for all of you out there. We talk about, of course, this advice, what to do if you're struggling to get a job, if you want to get a job working for a state agency or in other organizations, what it's like to work in environmental consulting. Matt also has a really strong social media presence. He has over 100,000, yes, 100,000 followers on Instagram. And we talk at the end about how he built that up. Today's conversation is so engaging, so enlightening. You're going to learn so much. And Matt is just such a great person to talk to. I had such a great time talking to him. So yes, this is a must listen to episode. You are definitely going to want to listen to the entire thing and make sure you follow Matt. I will give the links to his channels at the end. So let's get started. Let's talk with Matt and start learning from his years and decades of experience in wildlife field. Hi, Matt. Welcome to the Fancy Scientist podcast. I am so excited to have you here today.
I If I could just say a little disclaimer that my opinions and views don't necessarily reflect that of my agency. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to finally be a fancy scientist.
Yes, yes. So I invited you to this podcast because you follow me and now I follow you. I had a career post and you'd had a great comment with lots of valuable information about wildlife careers that I think a lot of my audience would benefit from. So can you first start off by telling us about yourself and where you work, and then we'll get into the background of how you got to where you are today.
Okay, I'm Matt Howard and I work for the Department of Transportation. And my title is Natural Resource Manager, but I often think of it as road ecology. And my main duties are to do analysis of impacts of roads on threatened and endangered species, specifically making sure we're complying with all the federal regulations. I've managed to carve out for myself a passion project, which is to identify areas where we are hitting a lot of animals and try to mitigate those collisions with things like wildlife crossings and pollinator plantings. I didn't create that program. People have been doing that for some time, but because I moved over from Division of Wildlife Resources, I was able to bring some of those relationships over and solidify that relationship. So I got my bachelor's degree at Utah State University in conservation and restoration ecology. And then I kicked around the consulting world for about 6 years. I did oil and gas work a lot, looking for basically species of cactus. And then I was able to transition to birds. I started out doing burrowing owl surveys, raptor nest surveys, sage. And then because I built that bird experience, they moved me over to wind farms. There I would do migration surveys for a wind farm. So we would sit out in a truck for 6 hours and count every raptor we saw. And then we would do presence absence points from before the farms were put in and after. And then I did carcass surveys under the turbines. And that was probably the thing that most made me want to move on to a different career. I just didn't want to count any more dead birds or bats. I moved over to the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources as an impact analysis biologist. And I was there for about 3 years and then moved within the state to the Department of Transportation.
How did you get into this field to begin with? Did you always love wildlife? Did you know about careers in wildlife? What was your starting point from being a child?
I think I got a little bit of a spark for natural resources when I was in the Boy Scouts. That's an organization that has a lot of flaws, but one thing they did that I really am grateful for ever since is taught me how to identify feathers and paw prints and all those kinds of things, and just start to get a feel for how interconnected everything is. But I started out as a creative writing major, and I was 3 years into a creative writing major, and I thought I was gonna be a creative nonfiction writer. As I was taking those classes for fun, I would take ecology classes or environment and science. Originally, my plan was to be a nature writer. What made me very discouraged is it seemed like if we were in nature writing, all we were doing was documenting how bad things were, documenting decline. There wasn't a lot of hope in that message. And so 2 things happened. I had a baby, and so I realized I needed a real job at the end of a degree, and there wasn't really a real job at the end of an English degree. I started realizing that maybe instead of writing about things that I had no control over, I could actually have an impact and do something about all these new things. I was getting depressed. So I shifted, and it was the 6-year plan for a bachelor degree. So I was almost done with a creative writing major. I had to go back and retake all of my prerequisites to be a science person. And so it took me a long time, but it's worked out. Having that writing background has never stopped being a benefit in my career ever since.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think writing is so important in this career, and people don't emphasize it enough. Being a good writer, that's for honestly every level of this career. I have my PhD, and obviously, science writing is really important for publications. I always thought I was a good writer, but science writing is different. Was that hard for you to move from creative writing to science writing? Because they're two different animals, not to use a wildlife pun.
One of the things that was really hammered into me when I was a literature major was to be as concise as
Yeah.
possible, to say as much as I can in as few words as I can, which is funny. I just said that was concise and I said it twice in 2 different words, but
Writing and
being
speaking are
concise.
different.
Exactly. Being able to would condense text and write concisely has been enormously beneficial, especially because most of what I prepare are compliance documents like biological assessments or our internal memos. And one of the things I'm always going back and forth with our contractors on is sometimes I think they want to make sure they put every single possible thing in that document that they can think of. And so one of the things that I picked up and I learned as a writer, and I had a job as a story editor briefly when I was in college, is just to cut, cut, cut. Don't put anything in there that doesn't belong, because every time you put something that doesn't belong, it's just another thing for an agency to double check or review,
Mm.
and it just makes these big unwieldy documents that don't need to be. So as far as writing with flair or pizzazz, you don't really do that, but writing concisely and using the right word when one word might replace 4 or 5 has been a really valuable skill for me.
Yeah, I agree. I was just starting to say that writing happens at all levels of the career. A lot of us think of scientific publications, but pretty much every job you're in, you have to have some sort of report or summary. So, whatever job level you're at, writing is important.
I don't think people realize even how powerful the way you communicate via email with colleagues is.
Mhm.
And so being deliberate about how you are writing, even within interpersonal communications, I think is a big thing. A lot of people pursue science because they don't want to do social stuff,
Yeah.
but that's the bad news. You're not going to get away from that kind of thing.
Can you tell us more about what you mean by email communication specifically?
A lot of the things I'll do is I'll review documents and then submit my responses to the person who prepared it. It has to be pretty concise. I keep saying concise. Sometimes it can be really blunt. And so
Mhm.
try to portray that kind of thing without being like, "Hey, I'm very disappointed in you," or telling people that they did it wrong, but making sure that they're meeting the standards of your agency. That can be kind of a dance. And so
Mhm.
that's one of them. And then especially when you work for government, everything you put in writing can be requested through Freedom of Information Act kind of stuff. And so if people are requesting that, just am very careful that I come across as diplomatic in everything I do. And sometimes it surprises me that other people in government don't have that same instinct. And I think that comes from being in a place where you would have someone who scrutinize every single word you used. in like a literature program.
Yeah, and email, I think, is especially tricky. I cannot remember the source or anything, but I came across an article that it was, I think it was email, where it was talking about how, like, it was some sort of analysis where people basically could get email like 50% wrong, like because there's no voice. Even just dealing in my relationships with my boyfriend, like I could send him a text and he'll think like something's majorly wrong. And I'm like, no. And like, vice versa. And it's just like the way that you read it in your head. So email is especially tricky because you don't have that intonation of the voice to help give you those cues. And I would say for people out there who are looking for jobs. A lot of my audience are entry level and they don't have their permanent job yet. I think email is so important when you're networking with people, when you're cold networking with people, and then also in your job applications. Because I heard somebody say this once that your cover letter is a writing sample, and that's so true. It's not just to get you the job and to tell people the experiences you've had and what you can do for them, but it also is a reflection of how well you will convey the organization when you're talking to other people. If you're not able to talk about yourself passionately, will you be able to speak about the organization passionately and positively and in a diplomatic fashion as well?
Yeah, I totally agree. And every step for people who are applying for jobs, I've been on multiple hiring panels. I've hired a handful of people. We look at every piece of information you give us. So the introductory email that you send in your package with your cover letter and your resume, and your cover letter especially, I sort of made a joke that because one of my coworkers was saying they were worried that ChatGPT was going to create very generic cover letters, but they're already generic. It's like people are using caveman ChatGPT because they just find a template and write their version over top of it. And it just is so rote and generic. I've read the same cover letter a million times, and that's before we have computers writing them. So ways that you can set yourself apart in a cover letter, make sure that you are showing that you read the job application or the job announcement. Make
Mhm.
sure you know something about the company or agency. I think it's kind of silly, but if they have a slogan, I try to incorporate that into the cover letter.
I do too. That's what I tell my students to do too. Like, or a portion of their mission statement, unless their mission is really.
Exactly. Yeah. The company I worked for, the slogan was sound science, creative solutions. And so I said something like, just incorporating that in. I had somebody come to a job interview once and they had just printouts of the program and they were just really well versed in it. And you can do that kind of thing. It could take literally 30 minutes before an interview where you just print out some stuff and get a feel for what they're doing, get an idea of some of the projects they're currently working on and then why that's exciting to you. I know it's so hard to apply for dozens of jobs and tailor each one, but one of those jobs could be the one that you're in for the next 25 years. And so it should matter. And whether it's good or not, we just use every bit of information we can get when we're looking at it. So
Yeah, I totally agree. So going back to your job first to get a little bit more information about you. I know you have so much good advice, so we'll come back to this. Did you ever imagine you'd be working at the Department of Transportation like that? When you think about wildlife jobs or jobs in nature, you don't think about roads. How did you find this job? Did you apply for this job? Or what were your steps in getting this job?
So the way it worked out is there was a big wildlife crossing project that was being planned, and I was the wildlife biologist for division of. I would go out in the field with the Department of Transportation environmental folks, and we got kind of friendly and we worked really well together over several months. My predecessor retired, and they just sent me an email letting me know that that job was open. And so if it wasn't for that, I would have never even known that job existed. I wouldn't have seen it on a job board. So part of it was just being in the right place at the right time, and part of it was being a pleasant and cooperative partner so that my name came up when they were looking. I tried to let people know that there are, I kind of call them soft spots in the market where you don't have a lot of people constantly keeping an eye out for positions there. And so you can be one of 10 applications sometimes rather than one in 150.
Mhm.
And so finding places, Air Force bases or military bases, they have biologists. Nobody thinks of that. Lots of internal corporations will have a full-time biologist. but nobody's looking at those. And a lot of the times they don't get on job boards. And part of it is because those agencies or companies don't even know how to hire natural resource people. They might hire one or two every 5 years. And so they're not putting themselves out in the same places where the wildlife agencies would be putting a position out.
How do you recommend people find out about those jobs then?
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of it would be to broaden your search, especially if you're looking for agency work. Sometimes I would put in the keyword for Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, or Forest Service, the ones that I knew had positions. And I would say instead, search for keywords about ecologists, but
Mhm.
not environmentalists, environmental scientists, biologists, and see where it pops up in different places. And you could probably do that in any job search. I have a lot of advice, but some of it is a little antiquated. It's like, I mean, I've been married for over 20 years. I don't give dating advice about people on apps. And so I don't know what the digital, I don't have LinkedIn and that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. So I don't know what that looks like. Where I do think I have some really valuable advice is interview prep and letter writing, contacts and networking, that kind of thing.
Well, when you mentioned corporations, like corporations have a biologist, are you talking about like consulting organizations, or are you talking about even separate from that? There are other corporations that have biologists. Can you give me an example maybe of what you mean by that?
One example, I saw a position come across just our internal sort of people sharing jobs with each other for a power company. And it was like one of the highest paying biologist jobs I've ever seen. I think it was
Yeah.
like $130,000 for a pretty mid-tier job. And that was a dedicated wildlife biologist for all of the impacts of power lines on raptors. And so something like that, I don't think you would be looking for that. That's a really good position and one where you don't have hundreds of people jockeying for it. They seem to be almost struggling to fill that position.
I sense that people would probably feel maybe like they're selling out too. Would you say the same thing that, oh, I'm working for a power company and they're ultimately causing environmental destruction? Do you agree that people probably perceive jobs like that? And what would you say to those people as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that comes up a lot in consulting also.
Yeah.
One of the maybe backbreaking or demoralizing things is a lot of people will come out with really fresh faces out of an ecology degree, and then they get to the oil fields where you're seeing landscapes get changed irrevocably, and you were a part of that. And so I think that can be really tricky. Part of it is you are just, taking your lumps, you're getting your resume built up. Another way to look at it, especially if you're working for a Department of Transportation, or you're working for a power company, is they need people who are conscientious, who are doing a good job in that position. And the amount of impact and influence you can have as a sole biologist for a development agency is pretty immense. And so, say you work for a power company, there's really amazing stuff you can do for like mitigation platforms for nesting. You can minimize the impact on birds, but also do really positive things as a way to defray those impacts and really hang your hat on some neat things you've done. You can go back to the platform you built 5 years ago and still see osprey on it. I think there's a lot of value there. And if you have someone who is, I don't know, I think there are people who could be just a sellout and they're just showing up to a job because they want the paycheck. They're probably not going to bring that same level of passion. And so that agency or whatever could be fulfilling the bare minimum requirements of their position, and everybody's content with that. But there's so much more you can do with a good attitude and passion.
And I think that a lot of people have this perception that just because it's a corporation, they're innately evil. There's a huge variation across corporations. Like Patagonia is a corporation and they do a lot of good. And just because you're not hearing about the good that the company is doing, we really only have surface level knowledge about a lot of larger corporations that we hear about. So we're not even going to hear about these other organizations. And maybe they want to do good, but they just don't have the people on their team to do that. So you can be a really influential factor. So you working for the Department of Transportation and road ecology, what kinds of things do you do on a daily basis? What projects do you work on?
So a big thing, there's not a lot of brand new infrastructure. There's not even really room for it. So a lot of what we're doing is things like widening. And so you have a bigger footprint and you analyze the impact of whatever that footprint is. We're doing things like laying fiber optic to connect all of our cameras or building turnaround lanes for snowplows. And so each one of those, we have to analyze the new footprint of the project and see if we're impacting species that are protected. In some cases, because we can't move things, they're already there. A lot of the times, what that ends up being is we are doing a timing restriction to avoid a nesting season or a flowering season. We might be creating new habitat to mitigate for the habitat that we could be impacting. So that is a lot of my job. And a lot of it is, it feels like it would be very hard and fast science, but it's a lot of relationship based kind
Mhm.
of negotiation work. It's not a skill I thought I had, but as I've been doing it, it's been a rewarding part of my job. That sort of push and pull of working for a developer and also navigating the federal and state system and making those partnerships and especially building trust between them so that if I submit a document, they don't think I'm trying to pull something over on them. They know me and they know that the work we do, we take a lot of pride in.
Yeah, is that skill just something you developed over time, or did you actively work on it through courses, or did you even, like, read books or things like that? Or is it just something you learned with experience?
Yeah, when I was at Division of Wildlife, they had a kind of internal course thing you can do and you get a little bonus from it. And a lot of it was communication skills. And so I think I got something from that. And then I've also just had some really incredible mentors. I will sit and watch how they will relate to our partners and also they'll correct me, especially in my communications. I'll CC them and they'll say, hey, next time let's do it a little bit different like that. I really can't emphasize enough how important it was just to watch people who have been doing something and also see people who I think maybe don't approach it the way I would like to and see how that falls as far as reactions go and alter the way I do things too.
Yeah. Do you do restoration work as well on roads? Like, do you work on creating overpasses for wildlife, or is there any type of work for using roadsides to create pollinator habitat, things like that? Is that part of your job?
Yeah, it is. It wasn't always part of this position, but when I came over, I said that's what I wanted to work on. And so we have had some really big successes with wildlife crossings. In Utah, we have over 60 underpasses that go under the road that safely pass animals. A few years ago, about five, we put in an overpass near Park City. That got really viral. It got shared all over the country. It brought a lot of attention. And with that, our state legislature got really excited and started setting aside money specifically for wildlife crossings. And this all kind of coincided with Secretary Zinke from the last administration. He had a big migration bill that provided federal money to states to be able to identify migration corridors that are bisected and start getting rid of those barriers. And so we're just hitting at the right time where the whole country is interested in wildlife crossings and our state legislature is on board and our agencies work really well together. And so we're getting really neat stuff done. I was just in southern Utah 2 days ago citing areas for a grant that we won that was part of the Jobs Act of, I want to say 2022, and we're submitting another grant soon. It really is an exciting time to be working on things like this. And same thing, pollinators and especially roadside pollinators have become a pretty hot topic. I'd love to plug a book, Crossings by Ben Goldfarb. It really kind of identifies so many of the intersections of roads and wildlife and why this is something we should all be paying attention to and maybe something a lot of people haven't really thought about. We don't think of roadsides as habitat, but they've become super important, especially as development approaches. You have these strips of vegetation that could be leveraged to be good wildlife habitat, but you also don't want to lure animals into roads. And so that's always the
That I
balance that we're navigating.
Yeah, I didn't actually think about that because these strips and stuff, they're really great for pollinators, but I didn't think about other animals moving in for cover or for food. That makes total sense. That's so great to hear, though, that the nation is on board with all of this stuff and excited by this. That's really exciting to hear.
People just got so enthusiastic. And part of it is that crossing that we put in that went kind of viral is surrounded by pretty major population centers. And we had mountain lions and bears and porcupines and bobcats and tons of moose using that crossing. And I think a lot of people who maybe are transplants to Utah or have lived most of their lives within cities didn't realize that they had literally in their backyard these
Yeah.
really charismatic, big, neat animals. And once you know they're there, I think you lock your pets up, but you also start really paying
Yeah.
attention and having a little bit of a commitment or a stake in the wildlife populations. They're not just something far away. They could be in your neighborhood.
And it's such a win-win because, yeah, people do love seeing these photos and these animals, but you are right, then they get worried about their pets. But also, animals are such a threat, honestly, for us drivers. I grew up in Western New York, and I was always scared at night driving, and I would drive ridiculously slow on some roads because I was always worried of hitting a deer. Not only I didn't want to, hit the deer, but also, people can die in accidents like that. So it's a really great success for drivers and people in wildlife.
Yeah, I read once people will always say, "What do you think is the most dangerous wildlife species in North America?" And I'll always say white-tailed deer,
Yeah.
and it's not even close. As a transportation representative, I will often wear the hat of public safety when I talk about these, and then I also get to be a biologist and talk about migration corridors and making sure that we're not separating populations
Mhm.
or populations that have historically been separated. We can get joined up again and start getting more genetic diversity and growing bigger and better wildlife. So it's nice to be able to, like you said, win. So few government people get to always just like post something and have everyone be excited about it. And so that's
Yeah.
just one of the most fun things that I get to do is something that very few people would have any issue with.
Do you have your master's degree?
I don't. I ended up with a bachelor's and I had the plan to get, I'm sure you know, a terminal master's through things like short courses, but I just never needed to. And now I'm almost 20 years into my career and it hasn't really come up. So I think I'm pretty lucky there.
How do you feel about the landscape for people looking for jobs now? Do you feel a master's is required? I honestly, personally, before I started mentoring other students, I thought it was honestly impossible to get a job nowadays without a master's. But I have had 3 students get permanent jobs without masters. They have had experience, so you do need experience. But yeah, they got permanent jobs without masters. So what having worked in all these different fields and hiring all these people, what do you think about getting a master's? Is that a necessity nowadays? Can you talk more about that?
I would say it's not a requirement, but like you said, the amount of experience you need to build probably takes longer than it does to get a master's. So I had 6 years of experience and I was competing with people who were in my position who were straight out of college with a master's degree. They kind of viewed us as the same on our applications, but having 6 years of experience, bringing that into an interview, I think made it a pretty clear choice because I just had been involved in so many things. On the
Yeah.
consulting side, having a master's degree or a PhD to put on a application or proposal for projects, I think is incredibly important. In the private industry, I would almost say that they put more emphasis on graduate degrees than experience.
That makes
That's
sense.
all anecdotal, but that's what I've noticed.
When you say you had 6 years of experience, are you talking about your college experience, or are you talking about when you were in college that you volunteered for places?
So I kind of think of my career starting when I started working for government because
Okay.
consulting was so ephemeral. It never felt like I had a solid standing. So I say 6 years of experience. I mean, I was like knocking around in consulting. I was traveling all over the country. I was doing real work, but it always felt like it could just be taken out from under me at any moment. And so then I came on with the state, and that's what I was talking about when I was competing with people with master's degrees, even PhDs. I had that experience, but getting in with consulting, it's really easy, I think still, to get onto a crew and do some field work straight out of college with almost no experience. A lot of the time, they just need bodies.
Yeah.
And kind of like what you alluded to, there are certain people who just will never touch consulting. They don't want to work on mines. They don't want to work in oil fields. They don't even want to work on solar farms. And I totally understand that. But if you have a good attitude and you just want to do the best work you can and you just want to build a resume, it's hard to beat as far as just getting your foot in the door.
So you mentioned earlier that, well, before we get to interviews, you mentioned, let's talk about advice for students. What advice would you have for students who've been applying for jobs and just can't get any? I see this all the time in Facebook groups or on Twitter. People are applying for hundreds of jobs and they just can't get interviews or land their job. What advice would you have for them?
So this is probably going back a little bit because it sounds like you're talking about recent graduates. But one of the big things is
I mean,
make sure you get.
it can be people with more experience too. I see both sides. I see people with master's degrees as well not being able to get jobs.
Well, even while you're a undergraduate, I would say try to get a summer job every single summer. It can be really easy to just be like, I'm going to go work for those same people again next summer because they know me, they like me, I already know what that job is. But what I would really recommend is do a completely different job every summer. And so that way, by the time you come out of college, you have 3 or 4 years of experience and you have this pretty significant list of species you've worked with and protocols you've worked with. And so that's a big one is don't get too cozy, do the same job over and over. I know it's different if you get a master's or a PhD, you do get hyper fixated or focused on one thing. And that's a whole different subject. I would say that's a big part of it. They told me this when I was in school and it didn't really sink in. Like I said, I think I'm 18 years out of college and I still run into and work closely with people who I had classes with as an undergraduate. So a
Oh,
huge thing is just if you're in a group project, bust your butt. Like really show that you are someone to work with because that person will remember you 10 years later. And so someone lucks out, they get a job, they're on a hiring panel, they remember you, you show up. That can go great or that can go poorly. I guess be a professional even as a student and show up and impress people. It sounds kind of hokey, but I can't emphasize enough how many times you'll probably run into each other, even if you went to a school halfway across the country and ended up working somewhere else. It is a small world.
yeah, that is so true. I totally agree with that. Like I did an internship in Kenya for a study abroad program, and I have essentially four cohorts of students that I worked with, and it is amazing how much our worlds still overlap with those students, and I see them in similar jobs. Or I got the same advice in graduate school that the other graduate students are going to be your colleagues. These are going to be the people you're writing papers with and stuff. And it's so true. When you go to conferences and meetings, like these are the people now that are organizing the symposium, that are the keynote speakers, people that you know. So yeah, I totally agree with it. And I didn't take that advice that seriously then either, but now I see it play out in real life. Just going back to the masters really quickly, do you think there's a difference? I know we're speaking just anecdotally. Again, we don't have any stats about this, but a lot of people want to get their degrees online or do more course focused masters, not get research. Do you think there's a difference between that and how you're seeing it play out in the job market? Does that matter that much? I always emphasize if people want to do research, they have to do a research master. So how does the online masters factor in?
Yeah, online masters I think are pretty valuable if you want to work in agency and there is just some HR person who needs to tick a box.
Oh, okay.
And so they treat a master's the same. I have seen people who dig into whatever your capstone project was and see if it correlates, or you could bring that up in your interview. So it's not, I don't want it to be like, hey, this is just a thing to get through bureaucracy because people do care about it and it does bring more depth to you as a person and as a professional. But as far as agencies go, I think that they treat it pretty similarly. The only thing is they have a requirement for a PhD or they expect you to get a PhD eventually, which I don't think there's almost anyone in agencies who require or expect a PhD. Like I said, those are usually called terminal masters. And so you can't go on further after you get one of those online ones. I'm a pretty big advocate for it, especially because natural resource professionals are very busy people. Those can be really easily tailored to having a life and a full-time job. Most places I've worked will even give you paid time at work to work on your online masters. If you had to pack up your life and move to another place and enmesh yourself in grad school and teach classes and do research projects, you kind of have to put everything on hold. And so I think they can be a really great way to move your career. In some places, you might get $2 raise or something for doing it. And so there can be a financial benefit on the other end of it.
$2 per
That
hour, not
helps.
$2 per
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what it was. It's probably better now, but when I first started at the state, you got pretty much an automatic $2 an hour raise if you got your master's degree.
No,
So
that's a
lots
good
of people will
rate.
do that.
So, and then you mentioned interview prep. Like, what advice do you have for people once they get the job interview? What advice do you have for them for doing interview prep and having a successful interview?
I think the interview is the most important part of the whole process. It varies based on agency, but at least when I worked for Division of Wildlife, every point you got towards whether you were going to get hired or not was all from the interview. The application, the resume, the cover letter were to get you in that room. And I think that's pretty scary for people who don't feel like they interview well, but it's kind of just a reality. Where I work now, we can put more weight on things like resume and experience and all that stuff, but it really is a chance to set yourself apart, or it can set you back too. If you just don't leave a lingering memory in the minds of the people, they might put down a nice score, but when they're all discussing it, your name might not come up. And so some of the things you can do to really set yourself apart, I mentioned it before, is put in some research. Especially, I understand that you're not going to put a lot of effort into cover letters and resumes if you're sending out dozens a day. But if you have an interview, that's where you can put in hours of prep to make sure that you make a good impression when you walk in there. And the way you make that impression is have knowledgeable answers to the questions. So you can dive into the job description, make a little bullet list, and make sure you have something interesting or smart to say about everything on that bullet list of requirements or qualifications.
I love that. I totally agree with that. When I had an interview at an agency job, the first question they asked me is, "What do you know about this agency?" It did catch me off guard because I've never been asked a question like that about the organization, but I also did my research, so I knew what to say. But yeah, I was like, "Oh, okay. Like, just tell me what you know." Like, they just wanted, I think,
Yeah.
they wanted to hear like what were the main things that you take away about our agency and what's important to us.
What I found, especially people who work for government, are generally pretty proud to work for the agency they work for, and they feel loyalty and commitment to that agency. I've been amazed at how much people are willing to put in, especially when I worked at Division of Wildlife. We say put on the brown because that's our color. People want to wear brown their whole life. They bleed brown. And so when you go in there and you hype up the agency and you tell them that you believe in their message and you're excited to work for them, that you, I mean, don't lie, but if it is a place where you wanted to work your whole life, just tell them. People really gravitate to that kind of thing. I think most of my advice is going to be agency focused, but they're not as competitive pay wise. They're very competitive benefits wise. But some of the things that keeps people in those jobs for a long time is they feel like they're doing good work. And so those are the kinds of people they're looking for. They're not going to mind if they consider this position a stepping stone towards another position within the agency, but you don't want to come across as you're just there because it's the next interview on your list.
Yeah.
So I'm letting people know that you know what they do and you care about it and you feel strongly about their mission. I think that's another thing. Nonprofits would be another example of really push how much you love what they're doing because they're there because they love it too.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I've done that on my cover letters. I remember when I applied for my Disney internship many years ago, I love Disney World. I would always go there as a child, but I also wrote intellectually too that one of the reasons why I love Disney so much is so many of their movies took place and they had such strong roles of wildlife. And for the most part, Disney got a lot of wildlife right. They were pretty accurate in the way that they drew animals. So I incorporated that in my cover letter or writing to the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is an organization I long admired. You can include things like that. It doesn't sound cheesy. And you're really, like you said, don't lie about it, but when it really comes from your heart, that authenticity and passion comes across.
Yeah. Right out of college, I had a series of interviews with the Nature Conservancy and I got down to the final three. But just knowing that they are pretty different from a lot of other nonprofits, what they do, they mostly, I mean, like that they acquire and manage land. Sometimes people would just have a tailored nonprofit and it could be so different. Every one of them does such different things. So yeah, really tailor it and Tell them why you're excited. And one of the things I would see all the time in cover letters is the first sentence is always, when I saw this position opened, I was excited because. There's probably a better way to put that because I've read that sentence so many times. So I make TikTok videos, I make reels. I have 5 seconds to get people to stick around. It's kind of like that when you're submitting a resume or an email or a cover letter. You just have a short amount of time to really grab their attention. And once it's grabbed, you can keep it. But if you're starting out with really generic lines that you saw in other cover letters, that's a pretty easy way to get someone skimming instead of looking close.
This is a great transition. If you have some more time, I'd love to ask you. You are super successful on social media. Like I'm looking at your Instagram right now, you have 104,000 followers. How did that happen? Can you tell us a little bit about what you do on social media and how it took off, your strategies for success?
Yeah, so I guess like a lot of people, I tried a bunch of stuff at once. And so early on, I was just trying to make jokes, or I was trying to talk about, I do some advocacy for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. So I was using that as a platform to start talking to people. And some of those videos did quite well. For some reason, I didn't even think about natural resource education. I thought that it was a little too saturated a field. But someone asked me, I can't remember how to put it, but basically create something that nobody else can. And so I realized I can incorporate jokes, I can incorporate advocacy, and I can incorporate wildlife topics in a way that if someone tried to copy me, they wouldn't be able to do it. So I feel like I'm kind of delivering a message in a package that even though it's a pretty saturated field, nobody else is doing it. And so I think it took a while, but I'm starting to get people who kind of get that vibe and they share it around, pass it along. Social media followings come all at once. And so you can plug along for months or even years doing the same thing and
Mhm.
get a little bit of traffic, get like, oh, that's slow organic growth. And you can have one video get 4 million views and equal 20,000 followers. I don't think there's a science to it. I don't know how much of an art there is to it. It's a lot of luck and a lot of just sticking with it and feeling confident about your message.
Yeah. And I'd like to add on there that even though the field may seem saturated, I always think there's room for different voices and you never know who's going to resonate with you. So even though somebody might be doing it, like let's say, Steve Irwin did it years ago. Steve Irwin never resonated with me. People love him.
Mhm.
I'm like, oh, he's too aggressive. He's too like in there. Like, I don't want to poke at crocodiles and stuff. So you might be like, oh, well, Steve Irwin's got that covered. I'm not going to talk about alligators and crocodiles and stuff like this. But people have different approaches and just people resonate with different people as well. So obviously what you're doing is working and people are resonating with you. I've been doing this for a long time. I don't have 100,000 followers. You're definitely doing something right. That's so cool that you've been able to spread that message. I've also found that like sometimes you just don't know what works. Like I did this post, I almost didn't post it. I volunteered for a project. I almost didn't go too because it was spring and it started to warm up and it was especially cold that day. I signed my boyfriend and his son up to do restoration. I mean, it was described as restoration day. I didn't know what type of work we'd be doing. And I think they were a little sick and they're like, we're not going. So I was like, well, I signed up for this. I should go. And all we did was pull garlic mustard. And, it was boring, tedious work, but I actually really enjoyed it. It was nice to be outside and everything. And I was like, I'm going to just like do a time lapse video of this. And I did a time lapse video. And like I said, I almost didn't post it. And this thing got so many views. It was like 40,000 views. And it was just like a super simple video. I think a lot of times we overthink it and like just sharing what you know, like you said, what's your perspective? What can you do that nobody else can do? Or can you say it in a way that other people aren't saying it from your personal point of view and that can resonate with people?
Yeah, it's funny. I had the same thing where I made a post that I was like, this is too obvious and silly. No one's going to even.
Yes.
And it had nothing to do with wildlife. It was about how I had just recently found out that a lot of women don't get their Christmas stocking filled on Christmas morning. So they'll fill everyone else's stockings and then they wake up to an empty one and they've done it for their whole lives. And so I basically just said, hey man, fill up your woman's stocking this year. And it got like 3 million views and they
Wow.
got on the news and everything. And it
Oh,
just seemed
wow.
like something that took no effort. And then other times I'll research a video for 2 hours. I'll read 3 or 4 papers. I'll stage all the angles and it'll go nowhere. especially when it comes to social media, they don't really want polish. People want to feel like they're just out on a hike with you or they're just hanging out with you. And so you do tailor the message a little bit. You want to make sure you're precise. You want to have a good joke at the beginning, but you don't want to be too precious about it. And there's almost a point where I realize I've worked too hard on a video. I either need to just post it or put it away because
Yeah.
if I overdo it, if I edit out all the ums and pauses, it comes across as too slick and that can kind of put people off.
Really agree. Yeah, and another thing is I think us being in the science world, obviously, I think we forget how little people know about the natural world. I'm in a master naturalist course right now. And when I applied for it, I had to explain, like, I know it seems crazy at my PhD, but in my PhD, I really didn't learn that much about natural history, to tell you the truth. I learned about science, I learned about how to conduct research, and my research took place in Africa, in Gabon. So I did learn about Missouri through my friends who were doing research in Missouri, but I didn't have like my own experiences there. So I honestly feel like, and then now I'm in a different state. I'm in Illinois. Some stuff is similar to where I grew up in New York, but there's just so much I don't know. Even last night, we were in a class on plants. And yes, a lot of it was familiar and things I know, but there's still a lot of things that either I forgot or you just like remember about how interesting this works. Like plants can have both male and female parts and how it all works, and all these things are happening in just this little plant. So a lot of times people, they don't know or they overlook these cool things that are happening all the time. So yeah, like you said, just don't overthink it. Like just point it out. Like whether it's your girlfriend stalking or look what's happening going on with this pollinator right now, or have you zoomed in on this insect and looked to see what's there?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And then another thing that I think really can bother me is there's a lot of misinformation or people who don't have a depth of information who have become kind of nature or science communicators, but they're basically just reading a Wikipedia article and sharing some facts. Or even worse, they're kind of perpetuating a myth about wildlife or natural resources. One of the angles I will sometimes take is something that is kind of tried and true. Everybody knows it, but the real story is different and more interesting. Trying to explain, hey, you've always thought this about X. That's actually incorrect, but the real answer is more interesting. I've had some success with that. And then I think that's something that someone who doesn't have a depth of knowledge or read a lot of papers or especially have hands-on experience in
Yeah.
the thing, they would just never be able to do that.
Yeah. I'm reading this book right now called Think Again by Adam Grant. And have you read it or have you
I
heard of it?
haven't. My wife really likes that.
Yeah.
I haven't read any of his books yet.
I highly recommend it. I'm gonna maybe even do a podcast episode about it, but I recommend it, especially for scientists, because he's a social scientist and he talks a lot about research where people think that you have to be like really like strong-headed and like set on a major point to like convey to people, but he's actually like people are more receptive and more willing to see the other side when there's complexity and nuances in it. And then also when you express doubt in yourself. I remember when I worked with teachers, when we said like we don't know as scientists, and they're like, why is this? And like, oh, like we don't know. They were like really impressed with that. It actually like increases your trust. And I talked about this with teachers too. When students understand that teachers don't know everything, it increases their trust in them and their curiosity as well in understanding the world. A lot of times we as a society, I think that you need to not have the nuance so that people get it, but that can actually have the opposite effect.
It's funny because I'll often try to record something when I go on a hike because the backdrop is really nice and it comes across as authentic, but I also don't have cell service when I'm out there. So I'll be hiking along and I'll be thinking, what are some things I learned in college that really blew my mind and sort of pass on that feeling of discovery to other
Yeah.
people? And so I'll record like, hey, did you know that this, and this? And it would be something that I learned in college. And then I would give back and I would pull up some papers to make sure that I'm not just making something up. And in the 18 or 20 years, that has been debunked or there is more complexity to it. And so then I'll have to go back and sit on my patio and be like, here's a correction to what I said when I was in the woods, because we have advanced and it would be wild if we hadn't advanced in 2 decades. But it's something I'm very careful about. I don't want to just perpetuate something that a ecology professor said offhand that stuck in my head if there isn't any sort of published weight behind it. And what has ended up happening is I've become more well-rounded as a biologist because I am constantly reading new papers. And it's not something I had been doing before social media because I want to stay up and make sure I'm not spreading misinformation. Now I know more than if I wasn't making the social media content. So that's kind of how I justify sometimes spending hours on a post, because even if that post doesn't do well, I'm a more knowledgeable person because I made it.
That's so cool. I love that. I'm gonna take that advice too. One of the things I miss about being in a research lab, at the time I kind of hated it, was lab meeting where we had to read. I mean, I like the idea of it, but I just was always so busy. Like in lab meeting,
Yeah.
we would read a paper together and discuss it. I was like, oh, I don't have time for this. But whenever we discussed it, I learned so much from not just the paper, but from learning how other people perceive the papers. Like, oh, I'm surprised they did this. And why didn't they think about this? And this is what we're learning about this. So I love that. I'm gonna take that advice too. Are you on YouTube as well?
I've tried YouTube a couple times, but I haven't really gotten much of a hold there. I think there's often times that I feel like I should make something longer than 3 minutes or so, but it's just so much work. I haven't really dedicated myself to it. I've had a couple videos that just got long because I couldn't figure out how to make them shorter, and I posted them, but it hasn't really done well so far.
I
But
think you should post your
there
video
might be something.
to YouTube too. I think they would like don't even change it, just upload it to YouTube. Because the great thing about YouTube is it's more of a search engine than TikTok and Instagram. For example, when you're searching on Google, you'll have YouTube results. You
Yeah, that's true.
specifically search for things. Whereas, I mean, people do that for Instagram and TikTok, but it's just not as nuanced. It's much more keyword driven on YouTube. So I highly recommend that. And just not creating any extra work for yourself, just using the same videos.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. Sometimes I worry that I'm getting beyond my skis because I'm such a generalist. And so I worry about doing like a deep dive into something that I am not an expert on, because my thoughts are always like, well, there's a true expert who would be able to do this better. But if they're not doing it, then that message
Yeah.
isn't coming across.
But
That's something I kind of have to get over and make sure that as long as they're researching, they're using the best available science and I'm
yeah,
willing to be corrected, I think people will go along with me.
yes,
The worry is somebody's like, I've been studying this for 30 years and here's why you're wrong. But I have had people reach out because I mentioned them in a study and they're just excited to see their study out there. And no
yeah.
one's ever corrected me, but I'm super happy if they're like, hey, the methodology was this instead of how you said it. But so far, they've been really pleased with how I summarized it and just excited to see something that they worked on maybe 5 years ago getting some attention again. So sometimes I think I will talk myself out of doing things before I even try it.
Yeah. I mean, the worst that could happen is you can always delete it. That's what I always think about. That really the only time that has happened to me with a professional. I definitely have YouTube videos out, like especially about my Black Panther video where people are like, you're wrong. But those are just, regular people. Or not regular people, but not scientists.
Yeah.
I did have a coyote video where somebody wrote like 2 pages worth of stuff about how my video was what they thought was wrong. And I could see their points because it's hard. There's a delicate balance between keeping a video short and concise and addressing the nuances, but also wrapping it up in a way for people to understand. And they weren't happy, basically. They felt like I overgeneralized too much and I used some words inappropriately. So I do still have the video up, the word carnivore, because coyotes are carnivores, but their diet is omnivorous and sometimes it can be
Mm.
highly vegetarian. There's some interpretation where I said they're carnivores, but what I was speaking to was the order, not the diet at the time. But anyway, there were some things like that. But I just included in the description some of the things to clarify. But yeah, you can always, delete it or unlist it and redo it. I have hundreds of videos out, and that's the only time that has happened. And
Yeah. And if you talk about coyotes, especially, that can get real nasty sometimes, or
yeah,
predators in general. I made a huge mistake and have felt bad about it ever since because I was talking about a study and I said an ecologist and his wife did this study. And then someone said, hey, his wife's an ecologist. And I just was like, oh my gosh, how did I make this mistake? So I made a pretty long and maybe boring thing where I'm just like, I'm going to spend the next 2 minutes telling you about this ecologist career because I messed up so bad. And people were really glad I didn't. And I think it went over well.
Yeah.
And so a big part of it is if you make a mistake, that's one thing. The mistake I made was like ingrained institutional sexism. And I think that's something that needs to be tackled with even more humility. It's something I hope I never do again, but I was grateful for people pointed out. And I think they pointed it out pretty nicely. It could have gone much worse.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is that you recognize that this is a bias and it's not your fault. We're not like birthed into this world with biases. They were learned and it's up to us to unlearn them. That was an important lesson for you and for other people. With the coyote video, I was actually, like, preparing myself for, like, all the nasty comments from the public. I got, like, nothing. And the scientist who commented doesn't even work on coyotes. It was really strange, but
Yeah.
anyway, keep doing it. You don't have to be the top expert. If that were the case, we would only have one video. How would you even identify who's the most expert on everything? You have so much knowledge, and you're coming from a good place, and you're doing your research, so I encourage you to do that. Well, thank you so much for this talk. It was so helpful for me. I know it's going to be so helpful for my audience. You have so much great advice and you're such an interesting person. So I will definitely put links up for everyone to follow you. And yeah, thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, I had a great time. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, have a good day and weekend, and I look forward to more of your videos.
You can follow Matt on TikTok and Instagram. His handle is at Howie's Everything Club, and there's an underscore between Howie's and everything. Get it? How is everything? He did say that he has jokes and everything, so it's even in his handle. And I'm going to ask him for his YouTube channel. Your next steps, if you are pursuing a career in wildlife, is to listen to podcast 89. If you are here on YouTube, I'm going to put the video up here so you can just click on it. That is my interview with Scott Putnam. He's a fisheries biologist. He's been one for 30 years. He also has so much knowledge, the wealth of information in that episode as well. So make sure you click, make sure you listen to it to get all of the best info to prepare you for wildlife careers.